slides, and that
Okay,
includes a few quick title slides, or it could go to 22, 24, something like that.
got it. All right. We'll go ahead and click go live. And 3, 2. All right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm here with Oliver, known as Semigog online. And I've been following his content for a number of years and have been interested in several of the topics he touches on, including mysticism. But today we'll be talking about where his name sort of comes from, the semiology component of his work. And for those who aren't familiar, semiotics, semiology has to do with the relationship between words and the concepts they signify, and then indirectly also the real physical referent at the end of the day. Similar schemes were used by ancient Neoplatonists. Oliver's also somewhat interested in Neoplatonism, so we'll see if that intersects into this conversation at all or not. But Oliver has a kind of interesting theory about the origin of written language specifically, and really views writing as more fundamental even than language, which is contrary to our common sense interpretation. They say that writing was invented by the Sumerians, right? And everything before that was maybe some kind of quasi proto writing. And we didn't have the capacity to represent concepts and things like that until much later. But it's interesting to think about the evolution of higher consciousness and human behavior in terms both of the linguistic aspects, but also maybe a more fundamental kind of territorial marking that writing actually originates from. So that's a very rough summary of the conceptual space. So Oliver, if you will, just go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll set a little bit more groundwork, how you got interested in semiology, semiotics, etc. And then he has some slides, so you can learn the theory that got me interested in listening to him in the first place. But welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much for having me. I certainly am aware of what you're doing with Return to the Land, and that's something that I wholeheartedly endorse. I wish you the best of luck with that, especially with all the, trials you're going through, travails, as it were, that one would expect to be hit with, attempting to stick your neck out in that way. So good luck with that. So I'm aware of you in that respect, and I've gone and checked out some of your things online. I saw a recent discussion with a fellow who had a whole lot of money on the table that he was betting on giants in prehistory. That was entertaining. So yeah, I've been around since I think 2016. Probably started out as what you would describe or could be described as the alt-light, and then eventually moved my way to where I am now, which is wholeheartedly endorsing what gets called identitarian positions. My channel started as something where I did focus on mysticism, the esoteric, as well as some things that are involved with semiotics and the rest. But I also had a heavy component of geopolitical analysis, strategy, the great game. But I have not been doing much recently because I got married and recently had a child. So that's, had me with my hands full. So I
Congrats.
apologize if thank you very much. I apologize in advance because I'm not, up on all these things that are actually my own work, because I've had my head in the world of, domestic building and development. But yeah, I came in 2016, and I've had these sort of political as well as geopolitical angles. Also, a heavy salting of things having to do with mysticism, esoterica, and these sorts of things. In terms of the basic ideas about writing and its origins, where would you like me to start with that? Because there are a number of ways I can come at it.
Let's set a broader background. So you're interested in linguistics at one level, but especially semiology, semiotics. So some people classify linguistics as broader than semiotics or semiology, and then other people classify it actually as narrower. So, first of all, can we lay out that conceptual space? To my understanding, semiotics is basically the American term for the study of signifier signified relationships. It was laid down primarily by Charles Sanders Peirce in the US. And then in Europe, it's Saussur's work. What was his first name?
Course, Ferdinand de Saussure. Yeah,
Ferdinand.
of course, in general linguistics. Yeah, it's much easier to
Right.
get a hold of Saussure, given that there's one small book that was put together by his students based on their notes of his lectures.
Right.
Yeah, but
And then
that's the
his
continental versus U.S. division.
Right. His structuralist semiology ended up being influential on postmodernists in Europe, French postmodernists especially. That's pretty relevant politically I mean, our audience will be interested in that detail because postmodernism is so integral to the changes that have happened over the 20th century. So, what was that about? How is Saussur's semiology connected to postmodernism? Have you looked at that question much?
Yeah, and insofar as I understand, I mean, it's a vast area, postmodernism and all the various tendrils that come out of it. I tend to think of postmodernism as basically everything that came after Nietzsche, but the well, let's start first with the idea of whether or not the fundamental ground of consideration that's most broad is semiotics, going to use the Peirce term, right? Or semiology, if you want to go with the continental philosophy, postmodernism, and the rest. Whether it's semiotics at the base of all of this, at the base of the pyramid of signification, or whether or not language is the fundamental substrate of, culture and communication. Most of the people in the tradition of Saussure, structuralism really comes out of his basic ideas, insofar as I understand it. About language, and these ideas got carried forward by people like Claude Lévi-Strauss, applied to archaeology and the rest. I'm sorry, anthropology. So the basic idea of the Saussurian tradition is that language is really where it's at. It's this fundamental substrate. Now, Saussure did not put it that way, as I recall how Saussure set it up, or arranged it in terms of his thinking. Semiology would be at the ground and linguistics would be a thing within it, because semiology would be concerned, as best I can tell from my reading of him, with all signification of any kind. So that could include, gesture, right? It could include dance. It could include posture. It could include scent, anything that can signify. However, people came along very quickly. Roland Barthes is one of them. He posited the idea of a translinguistics, that really spoken language, speech, language properly speaking, is so implicated in any act of communication or even thought for humans, that we really can't step outside of it, that it's going to play a role in just about anything when we start thinking of semiotics or signification, which is basically meaning. Peirce is a bit different. I'm going to hesitate to make any kind of sweeping statements about what he did or didn't mean, because I don't have enough acquaintance with his work overall. I'm familiar with his the aspects of his thinking that have made it into semiotics or semiology, but there's quite a bit more, firstness, secondness, thirdness. The issue, well, so first, let me make sure I'm finishing these thoughts. So the basic idea is, or one of the basic arguments where people diverge, is whether or not language is really the fundamental substrate. And whether or not we can do anything outside of it, which has political implications when you think about Gramsci. A lot of people don't know it. Gramsci was first and foremost a trained linguist. So after he came in and attempted to reset Marxism and to give it better prospects, he applied his thinking as a linguist in terms of how reality can be shaped to yield the results that he wanted. And so with the left, you have the idea that fundamentally, if we want to change human beings, one of the first ways that we can tackle that is by changing how we talk about things. So, instead of saying Negro, we can say black. Instead of saying black, we can say African American. And the idea is, or, we can say Zer instead of he or she. The idea is that we can come in and change language, and that will change the way we think, the limits of how we can think, according to what gets called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that that we are constrained by the words we have and the language that we can use in how we can think about things. So the idea that language is the fundamental substrate is central to progressive thinking, to the efforts of many of the people involved in the Frankfurt School. Saussurian structuralism was hugely, enormously influential on linguistics. And so we see how that got carried forward. Basically, structuralism from Saussure got transposed into all these other disciplines and academic domains.
So on structuralism, because that is very relevant today, even in like metaphysics, structuralism is one of the most prominent positions, ontic structural realism. Which is basically the idea that what's real is the relationship between things. The relata aren't fundamentally real on the structuralist view. So for Saussure, I know I'm mispronouncing it, but there's like a gap between the term and then its ultimate referent in the real world. Like nothing fundamentally grounds it other than its kind of cloud of constellation with other terms that then kind of mutually define it. And so every point in like the linguistic space is defined against every other point and ends up being sort of circular. So language operates in this kind of detached realm, which involves, I think, some of the postmodern tendency to abstract from the material and over universalize in an unconstrained way. Whereas, someone like, let's take Schopenhauer, who has a very grounded empiricist view of what concepts are actually doing. Words are grounded in like structural, not in the structuralist sense, but structural physical properties of people and brain activities and things like that. So there are certain ineluctable truths about the underlying referent world for someone like Schopenhauer. Most empiricist philosophers, the structuralist, I think, as a byproduct of their view of what language is doing and how important they make language, end up projecting that universalism inappropriately in a bunch of different domains. What do you think of that line?
I would agree. Insofar as I understand all these various interrelated subjects, I would just sort of put a cherry on top by saying that it's all about arbitrariness. The idea, which you kind of touched on there, but perhaps I can say it in a more strictly Saussurian terms. You've got the signifier and the signified, and the relationship between these is arbitrary. That's the bottom line. And, to explain that, you could deduce, well, in Turkish, if I want to say tree, I say ağaç. If I want to say it in Latin, I would say arbor, right? If I want to say it in English, I would say tree. And now none of these particular terms have anything fundamentally or necessarily to do with any given instance of a tree or even the category of treeness, right? So we can come up with any given term, and the relationship between that signifier and signified is arbitrary. And that's really, I think, the point at which the wedge gets driven into existence by the forces of progress, because the basic idea is that if anything can stand for anything, there's no relationship between what we say and any given thing that is. And then you tie it with things like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, so-called, mentioned earlier, where you're constrained in what you can think, and therefore, what your culture can manifest by the language that is available to you for thought and for communication. The idea that it is all arbitrary kind of gives you that primal position that the progressive takes, which is that we can sweep everything off the table and remake everything, because fundamentally the entire structure is arbitrary. Now, Saussure, runs that line, and most of the linguisticians, as they like to call themselves, run that line too. If you look at someone like Peirce, who is a much more sophisticated character coming out of, mathematics and logic, he sort of posits three major categories of signifier. You've got the symbol, which is basically something that is conventionally understood to be a thing. So a Peircean symbol would be like the signification that you see in Saussure. It's human convention that makes it mean that thing, because there's no fundamental relationship. So you could say the Star of David has a historical relationship with the Jewish people, but it's just one symbol among many. And the fact that it now on a flag stands for Israel is an example of a symbol. But you've also got a likeness, which is the icon, and so you've got symbol and then icon, which is fundamentally a likeness, which is where I see a picture of Arvol and I say, wow, that's Arvol because it looks like him, right? Because there is this, the likeness is more or less true. Then there's another category, which is the index, which is of great importance in terms of my own thinking, because that is a signifier that is not arbitrary. So an animal track, on the ground, if there's a wolf track on the ground, that is an index. It goes back to the Latin, you point your finger to indicate, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that this mark points towards a thing in a way that is motivated, that is non-arbitrary, because not only is the track a track of a wolf made by a wolf's physical passage on the ground, it not only indicates the category, but it also indicates the instance. It's not just wolf, it's a particular wolf. And if you're following its tracks on the ground, its indices, which point to it in a motivated sense, again, not arbitrary at all, then you can see that it's a given wolf, like one that might have a wounded rear left paw. And so that's where the world becomes the world of semiotics or semiology becomes interesting to me. It's the realm of the index, because it's not arbitrary. And we'll probably get into this later, but fundamentally the left has put all its money on the table based on the idea that they can remake mankind because it's all arbitrary. And my ideas about writing being a shared inheritance that human beings share with any number of other species in terms of orienting themselves in their environment and integrating their behavior, that points to the way that we organize ourselves not being arbitrary. Mm-hmm. And the focus on language, particularly because you've got academics who are using language to write their ideas and to, make it through their PhD program and to complete their dissertations and to get published and to have editors look at it. Everybody can parse the syntax and the words. They live in that realm. And so they are predisposed strongly, I would say, to not admit anything else as being real in the sense that writing is. I mean, you can look at how we talk about prehistory. Prehistory is simply everything that exists before writing, and history appears when writing does. But if you and writing, and this is extremely important, is understood almost universally, and certainly by all linguisticians and the people who haunt linguistics departments and publish books in that discipline. Writing is contingent and secondary. It appears only as a result of the fact that speech itself existed beforehand. So writing properly construed, which they call writing proper as it happens, is always, based on how they define it, it must be secondary. Speech must come first, because writing's role, writing as they have defined it, is something that more or less accurately captures speech, whether it's considered a semasiograph or a logogram or glottographs, capturing the phonetic information. So I'm kind of all over the place with this, but hopefully the one aspect is coming through clearly. The first is that these guys assume that language comes first, And you see that, as we were talking about earlier, and how they define semiotics. They're like, well, you can't really get language out of semiotics because it's at the heart of all of the ways that we signify. Um, but I have a child now, and no one taught him how to laugh. And when he sees me and I'm looking down at him, he's 4 or 5 months old, and I smile at him, he smiles back, and he might even laugh. Mm-hmm. He reads that without recourse to language. He can't speak, and it will determine his emotional state. And presumably, as he begins to be able to, perambulate, or crawl around, it's going to shape his behavior. He could see a thing, has nothing to do with language, and it shapes how he behaves. And then types of behavior can be applied in the real world, and we can determine whether or not one given type of behavior over another has survival value. So very quickly, you see that there is this world other than writing is contingent upon speech, and speech as this fundamental substrate of signification. It doesn't matter what language we speak. If I come up going like this, you know that there's something in the offing, and it at a very early age. So anyway, there's this kind of this world in which the leftist or the progressive or whatever has knit himself up. And because of the dominance of structuralism, the way that language was weaponized by Gramsci and others in the furtherance of their political projects means that they kind of exist in this one world, and they don't look at this other world that I myself would argue for, which is that writing came first. Is certainly before spoken language, because while animals will, and I hope to show this with some of the presentation stuff, while animals will communicate with sounds, certainly cries and howls and bird song and these sorts of things, they don't have what we could call speech, whether the langue or parole aspects of it, in Saussure's definition. But they do have writing, as I would argue. All you have to do in order to see that is step outside this blinkered world where writing can only be defined as something that necessarily is contingent upon speech. And if you see that there are ways that human beings organize themselves socially or integrated their behavior, we'll get into some of that. It's a technical term to say integrate their behavior, and I hope to show that here in a bit. Then you see that there's a whole substrate of human organization. And part of my thinking is how we can best show that substrate of organization, the way in which we ignore its existence in large part, but the way in which laws and social organization show us that everywhere it's very tightly controlled. The non-linguistic signification that I put under the rubric of marks, not M-A-R-X, but M-A-R-K-S, marks, like marking behavior. I believe that there is a deeper social level of organization, and it lies in a kind of non-linguistic writing. And I'm absolutely sure I did not answer all your questions because I got carried in a couple of directions.
No, that was a good intro for sure. So yeah, it's interesting. If marks, as what some people would call proto-writing, or even before proto-writing, like animal marks, if that is ultimately the groundwork of other forms of communication and other forms of organization within species, then just like understanding evolutionary psychology will give you an insight into current human behavior, understanding this theory and the fundamentality of this act of shaping your environment in a way that indicates, not symbolically necessarily, although including symbolic marking, indicates to others that something is the case, that this is your territory, that so yeah, I mean, if you're like me, an information reductionalist in terms of your view of nature, Plato kind of reduced things to form at a certain level. Matter is like unreal, the form is real. In modern physics, information is taken to be, by many physicists, the fundamental reality, and then space-time and everything else is emergent from that, which means that the way that physical systems operate is also through creating marks of a certain kind that act as memory aids for the evolution of classical reality. So I think what you're striking on is very deep, and let's focus on not the physics interpretation of it, but the behavioral interpretation of it because it does have political ramifications, and I like it. So first of all, though, before we go into your presentation, Plato and Aristotle both had views on the origin of acts of reference and why they're effective. So the symbol term was actually coined in like proto-semiotics by Aristotle. The Greek term symbolon indicated either a bone or a piece of wood or something that you would snap in half, and then the two parts could be brought together to prove that the person carrying this thing is the person you're looking for, right? So when you're carrying cash for somebody or a delivery or a secret message, you would use the symbolon to indicate that this part goes with that. And for Aristotle, the symbolic relationship held for words and their conceptual reference, and that was purely arbitrary. Although with Aristotle, you have to be really careful because when you're looking at a particular treatise, this is the later Neoplatonic interpretation on Aristotle, and other people have different interpretations of how Aristotle meant what he wrote. But I agree with the latter interpretation, which is that each treatise is very strictly in that domain that it belongs to. And so if he says things that seem to touch on ontology or metaphysics or anything like that in a treatise dealing with language or logic, don't take those things as metaphysical statements. Always take it from the perspective of the work in question. Like people view Aristotle's epistemology, for example, as a bottom-up kind of process, because in De Anima, where he describes the process by which humans and other animals acquire knowledge or seem to acquire knowledge, he begins with sense data. But he's doing that because he's building up the picture chronologically of how it goes. If you get down to how Aristotle believes we have knowledge of universals, forms, and he would reject the term forms, but like patterns that instantiate here and there, he would say that the active intellect, this kind of metaphysical entity, actually supervenes down on us, imprinting knowledge of these universals. And so you can't just take what Aristotle says for granted. And so although he seems to advocate a symbolic account of the link between a term and its referent, just take that with a grain of salt, because Plato's account in the Cratylus is a little bit different. And so the dialogue Cratylus centers around this character, Cratylus, who was a Heraclitean. And the Heracliteans, apparently followers of Heraclitus, believed that words just had the meaning that they intrinsically do, completely by nature, or really, one should say, by the givers of names who were divine or semi-divine. So, like in many mythological accounts, there's some, whether it's Adam in the Hebrew tradition or whatever the case may be, there's some institutor of names, the giver of names. And Heracliteans took that for granted, and well, that's the natural order. They were divinely inspired. We have the names we're supposed to. There's some natural link there. And the Cratylus kind of draws a fine line between the truly symbolic aspects of language that do vary between cultures and even people, and then the natural aspect, which, you know, he will highlight that there are innate natural analogical relationships between certain phonemes and certain aspects of concepts. For example, like the Greek letter rho has a rolling to it that indicates, for Plato in that dialogue, a kind of rapidity. So it indicates a rapid motion rather than a slower motion. This is like the onomatopoetic account of the origin of names, where because certain sounds sound kind of like the thing that they're referencing, that's where the names actually come from. And Plato's line is essentially that there is a more scientifically accurate language that captures more of the true analogical similarities, and then there's one that is less so. So we'll say, like in the Odyssey or the Iliad, the gods, they'll give the names of like a river, for example, as Xanthus. On the one hand, that's what it's named by the gods, but then mortals call it this other thing. And that's a trope in Homer, that they're the names that are given by the gods and then names given by humans. And it's that he notices that all of the human derived names are longer, And for Plato, like what is more contracted, what more condensedly contains all of the juicy, correct information and analogical content, that's the thing of the higher origin, the really more true form of language. So for Plato, it's like there's a spectrum between the most naturally fitted linguistic forms, which I think is going to bear on your theory of Marx, and then those that are more symbolic. Now they're talking about written language primarily, and we're dealing there for both Aristotle's theory and Plato's theory on the relationship between individual terms and their referent. Whereas what is unique to symbolic human communication is derivative upon that, and that's where you construct propositions by bringing multiple of these terms together. And so for like Aristotle, unless we have a ground for how the semantic value gets attached to the name in the first place, unless we can account for it, then when we start piling on a bunch of terms, building propositions, building syllogisms, coming to conclusions, we do, well, then how will we know that those conclusions are really grounded if we don't know where the simple terms even get their meaning from? So, like in the categories, it's all about these simple terms insofar as they indicate simple realities. And that's the start of Aristotle's logic. It's the start of his basic epistemological program. And I think, there you can see in Plato's account versus Aristotle's account, some similarity, some differences, and I think these two tracks kind of depart through time. The face value Aristotelian reading goes to Saussurean structural accounts, and this Platonic reading has really not been adequately explored. And I think that your account of Marx offer a deeper substrate. Because just like Plato thought that certain phonetic relationships analogically correspond to certain states of affairs, and therefore the act of reference has potency intrinsically by the nature of things, plus our symbolic association we add on top of it. With a mark, you have first the index, right, where like smoke indicates fire. Smoke doesn't arbitrarily indicate fire. It just does because of the causal structure of reality. And a certain mark of an animal, like, a warthog scratching on a tree, well, that's going to tell you important information about the strength of the animal. It's going to tell you something about their territorial claims. I mean, the same goes for their verbal communication or oral communication of animals too. It's like if you hear a loud roar, okay, that's a big thing making that sound. So the kinds of information that we can reliably derive from marks, from simple sounds, all of that's given by nature. So the idea that we can stack up from that, which is all built into how physical laws work, what correlations can be rationally inferred from certain things. So like I see a mark on a tree, I know someone was here. That's like, it's a logical entailment, but it's telling us something about the structure of reality. If that's the ground level there, then how do we like jump off a cliff at some point and have this purely conceptual realm where ideas are just free floating? I think there is a qualitative break, and you go from indexical reference to iconic reference, where there's a level of abstraction. It's not simply that X is associated with Y because it's directly causally linked to Y and you can retrace the link, but also there is some kind of eidetic similarity. And that's built into the structure of how neurons work, right? It's like we have these invariant representations or clusters of neurons that become hardwired together when we experience the same stimuli. The same invariant representations are triggered, and we tend to think of these stimuli as belonging to a class. That's just built into how we think. And so it's not only the direct causal link, it's also this similarity dynamic where when I see this, I think of other related things, and I think in terms of classes and types. And then from iconic representation, which like, an example would be playing at fighting for like kittens. They're not actually fighting. but they're indicating something, they're exploring something based on a similarity to the real situation of combat that is just given by the state of survival. And then beyond that, you get symbolic representation where there is some kind of jump or disconnect. But it can't be a complete disconnect because it's grounded in those previous layers of meaning that ultimately trace all the way down to like bacteria marking their territory with pheromones and chemicals that then communicates and coordinates the behavior of other bacteria. So going all the way down to the beginning of life, we've been constructively making these environments, marking these environments, imbuing them with meaning, but then also reading these environments. So it's like one big read-write cycle is the history of life, and you're using it also in a productive economic sense in that this study of Marx allows you to really think about the nature of brands in the modern day and how people interface with this very kind of primordial tendency to mark our spaces. So, with all that being said, let's, without further ado, go into your presentation of your theory because I'm intrigued by it.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess the aim of this particular presentation is to give you a basic understanding of where, and viewers a basic understanding of where I'm coming from. I know you're familiar with some of this. But the key aspect of this, though, that I hope that I can get across is that there's just another way of thinking about this. There's another way of looking at this. When you talk about these different things like the kitten playing at fighting, in ethology, they can talk about ritual behavior, which is behavior that develops in order to yield some sort of advantage. And it can become divorced to some extent from what it looks like, but it will still, you know what, I shouldn't even get into this because I haven't re-upped my chops recently enough on ethology, and I'm going to like trip over my own dick. But
ethology being the study of animal behavior generally.
Yeah, animal behavior. Yes, I should have said that. But let's come at, let me come at it this way. When you're talking about how there's essentially it's motivated versus arbitrary signification, right? Motivated signification is something that's actually tied to some manifest reality, and paying attention to it and modifying your behavior based on what it indicates yields survival advantage. So, as we'll see, some animals are, or you said like you hear a cry in the woods. Well, if you hear the cry of some beast in the woods, number one, it's not dead, it's alive. You know that it can expel its air. You can get some kind of sense of the energy it can direct, and you can get some kind of sense of how close it is to you. So you can make determinations based on this. And they are likely to have a survival advantage because they are motivated. They are attached to something. They are connected to reality in some sense. What we see with leftists and progressives and, postmodernist thinking in many respects, although that's not universal there. What you see is ways in which we can be disconnected from reality. So like if I'm walking down the street and it's 3:30 in the morning and there are three young black men walking towards me and I'm by myself, my immediate instinctive impulse would probably be leave, get to the other side of the street, secure my position. But what we have is this massive superstructure of words that have been pumped into our heads, and conversations we've heard, and television programs we've watched, and seminars we've had to go through with HR and the rest. And it says, well, no, I shouldn't do that because blah, 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 blah. That's one of the things I like about the right-wing meme, because reasons, because everything can, within speech and language, is at least potentially something that you can dump into the category of because reasons. Because once again, it's arbitrary.
Interject briefly. So here I see a contrast between like Lacanian psychology and Jungian psychology, where for Lacan, the subconscious is essentially filled with old statements that we haven't been considering lately. So you basically program and fill up your subconscious activity, and it's still active. Like there are complexes, linguistic verbal complexes that are operating in the background. So when you say like a leftist will recall all of the programming they've been through, and then that will actually impinge on their experience and give them moral direction and things like that. It's very Lacanian. And then the Jungian notion is that there are autonomous complexes that basically have their own personality. And so it's not linguistic structures, it is like metaphysical entities that we're communing with in the Jungian subconscious. So that's a very different one, is more right wing intrinsically, where there are essentially gods or forces that have to be propitiated and treated in a certain way, whereas the Lacanian, Saussurean subconscious is just a bunch of instructions that people have suppressed.
Right. You could say that to some extent, perhaps it reflects, the superficial understanding of Aristotle versus Plato. The idea that it's built up empirically versus pre-existing forms or ideas. Induction versus deduction. But of course, Aristotle, as you're better aware than I am, is more sophisticated than that. He, of course, comes out of the Platonic tradition, and there are any number of Renaissance figures who sought in their writing and teaching to reconcile these two seemingly opposed writers. Of course, they're not really. But yeah, there's definitely an aspect here where I want to get people to think about how this other system that we're not supposed to talk about, or that we're not supposed to recognize, just this thing that we don't see, and yet I hope to show in some ways how it undergirds all sorts of aspects of how we organize our behavior and how it is shared with the animals. In a certain sense, what I'm after here is to jettison the strict anthropocentrism, because I think I can make a case, depending on how you define writing, and I go with the definition of it that was presented by Roy Harris. We'll get to that. Depending on how you define writing, then you can come in and show that animals write in their environments and read in their environments, and they do so with results. It gives them survival advantage. It exerts selective pressure. Those who read and write in their environment, whether within their species or across species, inter or intraspecific, there are advantages. It might be the distribution of wolves in a hunting territory. It might be the avoidance of conflict, which is going to, cause problems, because when you get involved in it for no good reason, leaving aside something like a mating competition between two males, where the one that's more fit is presumably going to yield better offspring, right? But if you're just constantly getting into territorial turf wars as bonobos, or I guess I should say chimps or wolves or whatever, you're going to be burning calories and screwing your odds for something that doesn't really yield anything in the end. And so again, we sort of see this basic idea of motivated versus arbitrary. And with the arbitrary, once you jam that wedge into the space that is thereby created between an instinctive reaction and the behavior that should follow it, it's possible to just disconnect what we do from what we should do, what has survival advantage. And I think in large part, it comes from focusing too much on speech. That again brings us back to the thing of defining semiotics as being fundamentally about language, because they want to keep you in the genie's bottle, right? Versus looking at it more broadly.
Yeah. So before we go on to your presentation, which we already promised, but we'll just delay it a little bit more. I had this notion, thinking about the concept where marks are more fundamental, that maybe there's a kind of strange loop at play, where the symbolic jump, where it's not about a literal analogical resemblance, it's not about tracing indexically a causal process, it is about taking an abstract signifier and connecting that to an abstract concept that then can instantiate in many different contexts and have resemblances outside of the original dimension considered. Like a name resembles the person it names symbolically, not iconically. And that opens up this huge space where now we have a repertoire of kind of open symbols that can be constellated and can actually be used to model things like the laws of physics. So why would that be? And I think that the fact that that strange loop happens, where you go far enough in this process, moving away from like embedded causal local reality of systems communicating and get to this very abstract level, we have this sense that that thing that we reach is more fundamental because we can go back and apply that in a universal way, write these equations and things like that. And I think the strange loop may be like at some level, logocentrism is right, but it's not our language. It's that the universal logos, sure, is primary, right? Before the particular mark set down by particular hylomorphic compounds here and now, there are the laws of physics, which for the Neoplatonists were called simply the logoi, right? The logoi of nature, spermaticos logos for the Stoics. And so, maybe there is a structure like that where there's something to language and the syntactical structure that language unlocks that in some sense could be more primitive, as in it loops back to describing a more fundamental state of affairs than even the primitive like bacteria communicating in terms of exchange of chemicals. But like getting up to the point of symbolic language grounds the symbolic regime that we actually have in our particular historical context and in our particular hierarchical relations. And if you like want to sever that because a strange loop is possible, we should just like decouple or untether from the lived reality. Well, then like ultimately all of those words will become more or less meaningless and discourse will amount to like exchange of very high level, very vacuous concepts that are kind of deprived of their meaning. Because the meaning, let me also give my theory of meaning very broadly. I think it's also connected to the underlying physical dynamics. And essentially, a sign is a classical structure, and the meaning is like the quantum superposition that surrounds it. The meaning could be any number of things. With symbolic language, the meaning envelope or space, the phase space of meaning for a very abstract sign could be massive, and yet it doesn't mean anything to you if it remains in superposition. To derive meaning from terms, they have to ultimately be grounded. They ground each other, and you have like decoherence where, oh, now that I know what this word means, it refines what this word means, refines what this word means. But that grounding structure has to be consonant with the underlying causal dynamics. And that's interestingly, again, what Plato points to with, okay, what is a valid semantic theory for language, not just how do we arbitrarily link signifiers and signifieds, but like what should make the link. And it is like, okay, what's the natural connection? What's the natural meaning associated with the actual available forms of marking and even punctuating sound and time with verbal communication. So again, just another argument why maybe there's a reason for this notion people have of logos being more fundamental, but logos as we have it is deprived of its contents unless it is connected to and tethered to its not just its like metaphysical origins, but also its genealogical origins and what tradition it's a part of. Also reminds me of like Iamblichus on the worship of the gods, right? Where they recognize that all of these different cultures recognized Mercury or Zeus and called them different names. Well, that doesn't mean you just worship the universal God with no particularity. Iamblichus said, like, no, God through providence guides the names that have been given to the various members of the pantheon and the particular ritual sites available to people. So even though many people think of Neoplatonism or Platonism generally as being a very heady, abstract way of thinking, like their concrete recommendations were be grounded in a particular tradition that gives your language meaning in a beneficial and God ordained way. So help us do that, Semiagog. Help us ground our our concepts by understanding where this territorial space of marking originated before even verbal communication.
Well, arguably, in any case, I think it's a strong argument, but I guess I'll leave that to everyone else to decide. So let me try to share my screen here. Let's get over to a window. Yeah, okay. So is that showing up?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. I don't know if you want to center it. So
yeah,
just the right slide, just it'll make it easier for people to read the writing.
Right.
Let me see. And I'll have some notes under here. Let me see if I can pull those notes. Where are my notes? Notes page. I should be able to pull that up. Nope. Good gracious. Sorry.
Slides are centered for people.
Okay, I need to get out of here though and go back to normal. Okay, so yeah. Let's just jump through this. So basically, there are two ways that we can really think about this. One is, you know what? Let me see if I can just open this again, because I need to get at my notes, and it's going to look like I'm going to look like a retard with them visible on screen since I can't go to. Let's see here. Latent presentation. What's the old one? Let's see. Is that the one? Okay, let's see. All right, this will help. Okay, so basically what we have here is two ways of looking at this. On the left, you can see, I've got the animals and the human separate. And then I've got the animals and the human beings together. And that's really the opportunity here. How do we want to think about this? Do we want to think of human beings as something entirely separate? They've crossed some abyss relative to all of the biological life that, they came from, that serves as their foundation, or do we want to think of it as a whole? And because we think about spoken language as being this uniquely human thing, and then we think about how writing is necessarily contingent upon the existence of spoken language, we think about speech and writing as uniquely human things. And so we're always encouraged to think about it as we see it over there on the left, rather than as we see it on the right. So humans and many other animal species, they use marks to orient within their environments, as I hope to show. And in doing so, they integrate their individual and their collective behavior. So, we mark each other for individual or group recognition. We mark territory. We mark food and other environmental resources. And the marked environment shapes behavior related to mating, aggression, social organization, hierarchy, and the rest. So just to give us some context here, I am indebted to Roy Harris. He died in the last 10 years or so. I can't remember what year it was, but I corresponded with him briefly. I published along with some of his other students, and I owe quite a bit to him in terms of my theories that follow. They're based on a foundation, his own semiology and his own approach to writing. He was a chair of linguistics at Oxford, very, very sharp man. But he did some interesting things looking at writing in ways that other people have not. To the best of my knowledge, his theory of writing is the only one broad enough to serve as a useful basis for consideration of both human and animal marks. And it's that theory of writing was set forth by him in the book you can see here called Signs of Writing. As he puts it in a description on his website, he wrote, and I quote, "This was the first book in over 40 years to offer a new general theory of writing. It re-examined basic questions that had long been obscured by the traditional assumption that alphabetic, syllabic, and ideographic notations were merely visual substitutes for speech. It treated writing as an independent mode of communication, based not upon the replacement of oral signs by visual signs, but upon the use of spatial relations to connect events separated by time. So as Harris sees it, the underlying formal substratum of writing is not visual, it's spatial. And he adduces an excellent example. He's like, if writing were visual, then how is it that Braille works? In fact, writing is spatial. So rather than viewing written communication as a process of transferring thoughts or messages from one individual mind to another, which you see with Saussure and what Harris refers to as Saussure's telementational model, right? The idea that we just move thoughts or messages from one mind or to another. Harris views it as consisting in the contextualized integration of human activities by means of signs. So that makes his theory of writing broad and flexible enough to apply to the questions that I'm exploring. I bring it up at the outset because it's a fundamental bit of theoretical foundation for the approach that I take. Now, I don't know how much we can go into Harris's work, and Harris does not explicitly want to apply his ideas to animal marking, but I did. Let's take another quick look here at the integrational view of writing. So number one, communication is the contextualized integration of activities. It's integrational, not telementational. It's about allowing us to integrate, bring together, and make useful our own individual behavior as well as our collective behavior. So, if I keep a journal and I use it to track, what I've done in the past in order to make better decisions about what I do in the future, I'm just dealing with myself in terms of, recourse to that journal. So it helps me to integrate my behavior across time. Likewise, if we use writing to develop our culture or to commemorate laws, it helps us to integrate our activities. Number two, writing enables temporal integration.
Compared to the kind of naive idea that we have this inner space and we are communicating the already existing contents of this inner space to our interlocutor, instead, the communicative act is to integrate behavior, and it's really a metaxic activity. It's between the agents. It's not like I express what is already in my mind to you. And that maps pretty well onto decent theories of cognition. Now, I disagree with Daniel Dennett, but his multiple drafts model of consciousness, in certain respects, I think is really hard to argue against, where like when you begin a sentence, you really don't know what all the words will be that fit into that sentence. And it is kind of reflective where you begin using these words and that summons opportunities for thought on the fly as you go. It's not like you already have the full sentence ready. Instead, you are responding, you're like behaviorally responding to the speech context. And where communication is in its natural setting, there's interaction between multiple agents, and that shapes the behaviors, the semantics of what things can mean and should mean. So anyway, not telementational as in I have this in my mind, I'm projecting it out onto the world and to you. Instead, communication is fundamentally a form of integrating behavior.
Yes, and as you were just touching on there, it makes it harder to locate the center of whatever it is that's in question. It's not this content that goes from one mind to another. It's the result of all these things coming together. It's kind of like, how Saussure looks at language. It's not these, 6 given terms. It has to be considered as a whole. So in this way, writing is defined in some respects as what permits this integrated behavior to emerge. It also, there's this aspect that's non-kinetic. It enables temporal integration because it's relatively lasting. We can speak with sign language, right? And it will communicate through something that we can see rather than something we can hear. That's the nature of sign language, but it does not last, or it at least it is not relatively lasting. And so it does not offer the same kind of opportunities in terms of existing outside the person for behavioral integration. But the most important thing here is that writing derives its order from space. That is the absolute hammer blow to all these other types of or other arguments, on behalf of one take or another, as regards semiotics or semiology. It's the fact that the underlying formal substratum of writing is spatial, that permits all the rest of this to fall into place. And we'll see some examples of this. And lastly, it's kind of an afterthought now because we've been hammering it so many times, but writing shows no necessary relation to speech. And for linguistics departments and linguisticians, that's a heretical statement that most of them would be, or at least the less subtle of them would be very eager to dismiss. Speech is, as Harris has it, a single continuous stream of sound, which cannot use two or three-dimensional contrasts of any kind. People will say, well, the speech, it's a signal that's linear. No, that is something that's spatial. It is not linear. It is sequential. And that's an important distinction. So writing, according to Harris, is a form of communication which integrates past, present, and future activities by means of the organization of non-kinetic configurations in space. And that is a statement that's typical of his concision, his desire to be concise, because he comes out of the English tradition. And as I've observed in some of the things I've published, based on this definition, you could say that buildings are in fact a kind of writing, certainly marked buildings, because they integrate past, present, and future behavior based on non-kinetic configurations in space, which, ties into things like shaping society by looking at what types of buildings you create and how they shape human behavior. But right. That's just a little flag to stick into it there.
And let me indulge a little bit my physics speculation here, because I see the same exact dynamic going down to a preferred basis in quantum mechanical decoherence being some structure that can be repeatedly referred back to. And so it stabilizes the way that other things decohere and can collapse, so-called. So again, the classical reality is like the actual sign, and then this superposition of possible contexts around it is defined by that thing that is sort of acting as the writing there. And then the further up you go, the chain, I think the same basic dynamic holds, where a bacteria will put out a particular number of molecules to attract other members of its species or to fool prey or whatever it is. It's laying out this definite classical structure. I have emitted these chemicals here. And then there's this realm of all the possible action that's going to be influenced by that. So it's one, you define a setting classically, and then that opens a superposition of possible context / meanings. So like, what is the meaning of this writing, which is the building? Well, it's the flow of how people can now move in and around that space. So I do think it's a fundamental thing, but I'll let you keep going. We don't have to go back to the physics again.
Oh, no problem. I would jump in more on it, except my ignorance of physics is lamentable. So, I'll have to I'll just ride shotgun with you on that aspect. So, why am I talking about Marx since Harris is talking about writing? Well, I see Marx as a distinct subcategory within writing as integrationally defined. So the focus here for me is not on linguistic writing, which is of course not common to many animal species. They're not, they don't learn the alphabet, nor am I taking into consideration all the other kinds of signification covered by semiotics or semiology in general, things like posture, gesture, facial expressions, dance, fashion, music, and the rest. So because marks, and I hope it's shown by this diagram, because marks are used by human beings and by other animals in much the same way, I see marks as a clearly delimited category that stands on non-arbitrary foundation, because marks can be justifiably viewed as distinct from linguistic writing, which is often called writing proper. It's important to be very careful with terms like proto-writing and pseudo-writing. That's why I hissed earlier when you said proto-writing, because that's a term to define something based on what it isn't. And anyone who's interested in philosophy or just academic precision shouldn't be using that term. And of course, books are filled with people talking blithely about proto-writing. It's like, well, it's this thing that it isn't yet, and that's how we can understand what it is, because of what it isn't yet, which I think is just ridiculous. So again, we want to define marks based on what they are rather than what they aren't. So if you look at the diagram, you can see that you've got the larger domain, the largest domain of writing integrationally defined. And then within that, you've got linguistic writing, which is writing contingent upon speech, right? That's the writing proper that captures and makes lasting speech acts, or whatever, what have you. But we have the idea of marks used by humans. That includes linguistic writing, but it also includes the marks used by animals. And the marking practices that we, to a more or less obvious extent, share with animals are the ones that interest me here. So we'll go through some parallels just to try to, basically, I'm trying to help people to see things as I see them. We'll see whether or not I'm successful in that. So, here we can see parallels between human marks and animal marks. The ones on the top are, you've got cat scratches up on a tree trunk. You've got bear claw marks there, where the human hand is shown on the bark of the tree. And then I believe the other one, the tree there, is a rub, from deers in a given season rubbing their antlers against the tree and stripping the bark away. The ones below are photographs that I took walking along the Sahil Yolu in Istanbul, just, looking at the kind of marks that get scratched and cut into trees by humans in such a universal way across the world. That I can't help but see the parallels. The other thing that you have to understand here in terms of the animal marks is that these are not strictly visible marks. They are scent marks also. So when a cat scratches a tree, it has scent glands in the pads of its feet. So likewise with these other animals, when they rub those trees, the ethologists refer to those as visual advertisements. But the marking is fundamentally olfactable, which means it's scent marks. Now, once you recognize that writing is not visual but spatial, it is possible to understand the environment as something like a page. It is the writing surface, and the marks that are made upon it in space needn't necessarily be visual or only visual. These marks can play their role in space, just as Braille, which no one sees. None of the people who are intended to read it by their sense of touch are expected to see it, right? Likewise, scent marks on the environment, within the environment, that you can think of as being like a page, are positions in space that are relatively lasting. And they also have the very interesting dimension of decay over time, as the volatile aspects of the scent signature break down. So you not only have a mark there, but it has a kind of a date on it to some extent, not in the strict sense of a calendrical date, but in the sense of, wow, this mark was made some time ago versus this mark that clearly was made recently by an animal pissing on the tree, because the mark is still wet, right? And the scent is still strong. So we see a parallel here.
Yeah. So you would expect this to be one of the more fundamental aspects of how marks function, if, again, genealogically, the scent aspect goes much deeper. Like bacteria, once again, don't have eyes or ears. They don't have the other senses. They do have something like smell, because they can detect the frequency of molecules within a particular range, which gives them distance So, but even like not Cartesian space per se, it doesn't allow them to draw a coordinate grid. It just says I am this close to the thing that I want or the thing that I want to stay away from.
Right, or this mark is older or newer based
Mhm.
on its intensity, right?
Right.
Um, so, and we can see like this. I remember when it first hit me. People scratch all kinds of aggressive and sexual messages in the bathrooms where they all piss. So as soon as you get to a place where there are a bunch of competing scent signatures, which is to say, for example, a public bathroom, right? You're in there in a place where it's contested. So not only do we go in that place to piss, any number of us seem instinctively driven to scratch our marks into the walls. And very often, the type of things that are communicated are sexual or aggressive. Is symbolizing territorial contest or the desire to mate or to signal about one's fitness to mate. Now, of course, I'm being charitable in characterizing the kind of things you see scratched on bathroom walls that way. But for he who has eyes to see, you can see that where we're leaving those scent signatures, we also seem to be instinctively across the world driven to make visual markings at the same time, which correspond to these territorial and mating concerns that you find with animals. Likewise with men.
So, do you recommend that like advertisers associate their brands with particular scents when they put up, a billboard or poster? Maybe not
people have done
feasible,
that,
but
and
really?
no, there's a whole area. It never went very far, but there are. I mean, for example, the smell of the cooking beef patties at a Burger King.
Mhm.
There are people who have looked at the best ways to make that scent detectable from outside the restaurant, so it draws you. There are people who
I knew it was
experimented with,
intentional. Wow.
yeah, or like the smell of fresh bread at Panera, right when you go in the door. These
Mhm.
are fundamental kinds of things. There's also, with where you would expect it with cosmetics that have a particular scent, or different types of food, or shampoo, or obviously perfumes, colognes, these sorts of things. There's a whole aspect. I mean, I didn't get into this at the beginning introducing myself, but I've got more than 30 years in advertising and branding and graphic design and these sorts of things. So I work in this world, which is part of what brought me to this whole odyssey, I suppose. One day I was sitting on a porch. I collected antique weapons. I was sitting on the terrace at my friend's place in L.A., and I remember he had a Quebecois flag flying on his terrace, and he came out. I'm working in branding and things, and he comes out. He brings out this Circassian helmet, and 18th century, chainmail coif on it or whatever, and or aventail, if you will, and some markings on it. And I pointed to this little sign next to the Arabic inscription, and I'm like, "What the hell is that?" And he's like, "Oh, that's a tamga. That's a clan sign of the Caucasian tribes." And so I'm like, looking at the fleur de lis, repeated on the Quebecois flag, and thinking about brands, and then looking at this damga. And since I was into esotericism in my youth, I was also thinking about what's called the Ars Notoria, which is supposedly a secret way of learning things and very rapidly and remembering it. It's like a magical way to learn things that's faster than the normal method of doing it. And so, magical signs, branding, clan and tribal signs, and heraldic insignia, flags, and emblems, they all sort of came together and led me down this road once I recognized that the first creatures to write did so before humans did. But I'm sorry, that's a bit of a tangent there. So with olfactable and visible marks, we were talking earlier about motivated versus arbitrary. One of the important things is that animals will attempt to get their urine as high onto the tree as they can, because another animal, certainly a conspecific, coming along, and you'll see it when you're out walking your dog, it's going to sniff the base of the tree, and it'll sort of sniff up, and it will get to the point where the stream of urine hit the object at its highest point. And from that, they can, in a non-arbitrary, in a motivated way, make determinations about the size of the animal who made the scent mark. If not in a strict sense, in terms of coordinates on a X, Y, and Z axis, they can certainly determine kind of like you were talking about with chemical communication earlier. They can make a determination about whether or not it's bigger than I am, you know, and therefore make determination. Okay, it's a fresh mark. It was made by an animal that's larger than I am. That means that I'm probably not going to contest this territorial claim. So you can see the pug or whatever they're intentionally doing a handstand to yield the mark that is as high up the tree as it possibly can make it. So you can see that there is a bit of dissimulation, deceit that can enter the world of animal chemical communication. You see it with insects as well, where they can mislead. And so while there is this aspect of it being motivated and non-arbitrary, it's not strictly so, because deception enters this world too, because it yields survival advantage. People have caught on film instances of panda bears also doing handstands in order to get their genitals as high into the air as possible to hit that tree with the stream high up enough that any other animal coming along is going to be like, damn, whatever made that piss stream, I don't want to mess with it because it's, 4 feet up in the air. So you can also see with graffiti, which we're going to get into a bit here, there is also a very strong drive on the part of so-called graffiti artists to get up as high into the air as possible to leave their tags. And I think there again, like we were talking about with the bathrooms, with the aggressive or the sexual imagery and marking, we could see yet another example of the parallel here with olfactable and visible marks in terms of what the animals do instinctively, and what I would argue the people involved with graffiti also do, at least to a certain extent, instinctively. So again, we have to understand that I'm treating the olfactable and visible marks, or olfactory and visual marks, as being interchangeable in terms of how they organize space and the furtherance of integrating behavior both within and between species. So are we still good on time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, moving along here, here's another parallel in terms of how space is organized by marking. So on the left, you can see an animal's territory, right? And you can't really see it clearly, but you've got like an H1 and an H2. And the H1 is home one. That's the maximum relative concealment. It's in the center of territory, designed to have as much buffer space around it from the peripheral territorial marks. So you're in the heart of your territory. Animals will generally defend themselves more strongly as they get driven to the center, because you're going to have nests, you're going to have food caches, these sorts of things. So, while they might be willing to not engage at the periphery, once you get into the heart of things, they're going to be much more strongly motivated to stand and fight. So you've also got markings here that show bathing places, feeding places, places for excretion, and if when it's distinct from excretion in general, places where they urinate and defecate. You've got their demarcation points where they drink, where they store food, and it's organized in this space with their paths through it. And so you've got the periphery, and then you've got sort of the heart of it. And this is laid out with both visible and olfactable marks. On the right, you can see a map or a diagram showing a Roman castrum, or a military camp. And the first act, when the legions were marching along and they were going to set up for the night, they would, the troops would deploy, and they would begin to dig, and they would make a trench, and they'd use the soil from that trench to make the wall to create the periphery. They would create the paths through the camp with the different gates, so they had access. They would leave clear routes. But the most important thing would be to set up the standards of the legions in the center, near the command tent. And then you had the places where they would sleep, where they would defecate, where they would prepare food, where things would be stored, where the animals would be kept, and the rest. So once again, you can see how the human beings, based on things like first placing the standard and then seeing that as the nest, the area that would be most strongly defended. We all know the traditions of how the bravest of soldier were the bannermen, or the ones who held the standard, because it should never go down. And it's not just a symbolic orientation. When you're in the midst of a battle, and you're jammed up against another shield wall and there's dust kicked up on all sides and people are screaming and you can barely hear, being able to look to a banner up above you plays a critical role in your ability to, well, integrate your behavior in the furtherance of your military activities in a way that, if you don't get it under control, it's, you've either got the survival advantage or you die, you lose. So again, here we've got parallels in the organization of space. Relatively lasting markings, whether it's olfactory or raising a standard with a particular insignia on it. So again, this is to say that marking the environment provides clear survival advantages, and we can see this parallel in terms of the animal behavior and the human behavior. So,
right. And also how
we've got
interactive it is with the evolution of the environment too. It's not like this is just a blank canvas and you're presenting material on it. Instead, you are modifying your environment that in turn modifies you. So the read-write process seems to be pretty fundamental here. And the recollection process as well is not, it's not only one directional. Like when you read a signal, you're also impacting that landscape as far as, that's going to motivate you if you're another dog to write over it, or it's, so yeah, just if you interpret territorial behavior as well as the creation of ecologies partly in this frame, I think you'll get some insights. So please carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, these are where the animal chooses that center point that gives it the most concealment, around which the periphery will be developed, right? And based on the presence of the feeding sites and the water and the rest, right? Likewise, with setting up the castrum, the Roman camp, they're going to choose the best ground for that and the most defensible ground. So they'll choose, a high point or a place with visibility, or they're not going to build it right next to the edge of a forest where an enemy can be right up on their walls before they're seen, right? So yeah, there is that reciprocal aspect of the selection made in terms of the environment, and then the activity within that environment that shapes it, etc. So in terms of some of these other parallels, we've got, territory and competition. The image you see here is from Uexküll, Jacob von Uexküll's foray into the worlds of animals and men. Uexküll was a pioneer, Estonian pioneer of biosemiotics, a brilliant guy. I find the biosemiotics much more interesting, honestly, than the Peirce and the and Saussure and the like. Again, because I'm interested in behavior and that as a fundamental baseline in terms of evolution and the rest. So this is an image. It shows a map of the Hamburg Zoo, and the little marks that you can see that accumulate along the paths is where two male dogs urinated in competition on their daily walks. And Uexküll notes the places where they left their odor marks were the same as those that were easily recognizable to the human eye. Wherever both dogs were walked at the same time, a urinating contest regularly occurred. So we can see how this same sort of thing happens with so-called graffiti artists, how they have the same sort of competitive drives. And I didn't even realize this until I started to look more into it. There are aspects of tagging, the illegibility of tagging and the rest that we'll get into, but I didn't realize what goes on in these groups that call themselves graffiti artists. There was a 2005 documentary called Infamy, and it had a number of examples. They were interviewing all kinds of so-called graffiti artists, and there was a female graffiti artist based in New York. And in reference to becoming against so-called graffiti artist, she said, there was something in my life that was missing. I did not feel like I was here. And I really wanted to prove to myself, like, oh, look, I am here. There's my name. Graffiti just kind of drowned out all of the insecurities I had about myself and just made me feel like I could really do anything. So you have this woman who feels like she's not there. And now when she sees her marks on the environment, she's like, oh, yeah, I am there. I do exist. And then there's other quotes from that documentary, which I recommend people check out. Again, it's called Infamy. It's 2000, what did I say, 2005. There are other quotes like, it's a wild feeling of really being connected to your surroundings, and you can just take a little piece and it's yours. And then there's another one where the person was remarking while putting a fresh mark above a competing mark in a particular claimed location. The quote is, "I'm fixing my spot. Somebody mistakenly thought that I'm sleeping and that I'm not maintaining my spot, but they're wrong. I can't let this go on." And quote, "I have learned, that if somebody else has a spot, you can't take their spot unless it's dissed." And then there's a graffiti artist, again, so-called in Philadelphia. He's referring to the route that he travels in Marx. He said, "I had a bus route that ran by my house. I had to let people know that that was my route. They come through my hood. This is my route." And he also said, you take a bus route, a Charlie route, a subway line, and that's your route. You see, these are routes. It's not strictly that you place your mark in a place. You're laying out your path. And he says, you route it from beginning to end. I didn't just bomb it with cans. I scratched the windows with rocks, took markers to the mailboxes and signs, stickers, whatever it took. And then there's one with an artist in LA, again, artist. He says, you run out of this kind of paint, but you're away in the middle of nowhere, So what do you do when you run out and, well, there's not much left? You piss inside to make a little bit more, to make the paint go further. The guy's literally pissing into his paint before he puts it on. So I can't think of a better way of showing how the visual and olfactable aspects are, they have these shared biological origins with animal behavior, regardless of whether or not these so-called artists are conscious of it. So let me jump down here. We've got another one with territory and competition and graffiti. From the perspective that I'm developing here, institutions are or should be understood as mechanisms for behavioral integration extended in time and space through the making of marks. So, you have the marks of of currency, or the Great Seal of the United States, or the American flag. In this respect, these marks of institutions mirror the way in which marks establish a territorial claim in space and across time. So if you turn to graffiti again, what we're looking at here is from a paper by Ley and Sibrewski. It's a 1974 study called Urban Graffiti as Territorial Markers. It's a great paper. These guys were into maps and geography. As they noted in their observations, quote, "Graffiti are a visible manifestation of a group's social space. Moreover, assertive or aggressive graffiti represent more than attitudes. They are dispositions to behavior. And as such, they impress a bolder outline on the fuzzy transition between perception and action." And that's a very important point they make. Marks have to be understood or recognized as indicators of dispositions to behavior. So in these examples, these maps that you look at, he's got different gangs associated with different streets and regions, and you can see how they're graffiti for the gangs associated with ethnic groups, as you'll see if you can make that out in the legend, cluster in different areas based on how they see that as their territory and how they defend it. And so we can see in these examples how graffiti represents a claim to territory, or again, looking at the so-called graffiti artists, or critical routes through it, coterminous with the extent of dominant mark making. We see that just with bearing the insignia of sports clubs or team affiliation. And that's based primarily on region. And, when you show up at a football game in Europe somewhere and you've got, the wrong team colors on, that's another example of using marks to claim space. Istanbul, where I live, Fenerbahce is associated, with the colors yellow and blue, and they're over on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. Beşiktaş is closer to Beşiktaş, and their colors are black and white, right? If you got two teams that are at each other's throat at a given time, you don't want to show up on a Friday night when everybody's drunk after a game wearing the wrong team colors. The team colors, the insignia, the graffiti, these kinds of things are displayed prominently. And intrusions by outsiders wearing the marks or colors or making the marks of rival teams or rival groups, they're going to be met with aggression. But regardless of whether we're talking about individual or collective behaviors, or if we're talking about urban gangs or sports clubs or corporations or political parties or nations, the biological behavior basis for this behavior is certainly apparent to me. Now, the thing is that we not only have the territorial markings, and we touched a little bit on resource marking, um, but that's something we should go into more, because resource marking is is an aspect of this that is important. So we've got here in this image, we've got a Turkish cookie with an ancient Hittite religious symbol on it. That's just an aspect of marketing. We've got a loaf of bread baked in Istanbul that continues the tradition of the ancient Byzantines, where bread would be marked, because it's important to the state to track the use of grain and the availability of bread for the population, certainly so that you don't run into issues with famine and the rest. We've got the prosperon on the bottom right, the special Orthodox bread that's baked in two sections to indicate the dual nature of Christ, and it's got the stamp on the bread, and of course you've got the host there with the cross on the wafers. So these are examples of resource marking. Now, it can take the form of text, as it does with the little paper tag that's been baked into the bread, but it needn't be a textual mark. And in any case, the function it serves is not necessarily or strictly textual. The point is that we also mark our resources. In the example of the baked goods that we see here. Now, this we see with animals as well. Captive coyotes, they urine mark their food piles and their individual food items so that they can locate them. And this doesn't necessarily reserve the food for the marking animal. You've also got red foxes and wolves who use urine to mark their food caches after they've been emptied. Right. Rats will urine mark over preferred foods. They deposit attractive cues on and around foods that they like. Young rats find these marks attractive and prefer to feed at sites marked by other rats. It's one of the ways in which rats can acquire food preferences through cultural transmission. You also have parasitic insects that will mark the hosts in which they lay their eggs, and that can act as a deterrent to conspecifics to a certain extent, which we'll touch on in a bit here. But did you want to say something? Sorry, I'm just running.
Yeah, well, the resource marks bring up this thought that I wanted to include, that there is an uncanny power to these symbols because of the deep history with them. So they're intended to indicate tendencies of behavior, and especially territorial, aggressive, competitive behavior, and to indicate boundary lines of what you do and you don't do. And those have potency beyond just telling someone there will be a consequence. Like if you see an official notice, condemned, don't enter, versus like a handwritten notice, it's going to make a big difference. And like the root of that, I think, is the fact that these marking tendencies have been with us for billions of years. It reminds me, are you familiar with Eric Gahn's theory of the origin of language?
No.
Okay. So his notion is that language evolved through one kind of originary act of distribution of food, where dominance hierarchies, one of the big tells is who gets to eat first, right? And there's all sorts of competition, especially in primate tribes, where the alpha, like multiple betas gang up on the alpha, kill him, and like one replaces them. And so this like who gets to eat first, who gets to breed first, whatever it is it leads to mimetic self-destructive cycles. Like what's the guy's name? Starts with a G. He talks about Christ in these same terms. I wish I could remember. Anyway, incidental. Maybe someone in the chat can figure out.
There's the guy who famous Homo Nakans, looking at sacrificial behavior and distribution of food as like a fundamental
Yeah, but
culture building
specifically with
practice.
mimesis, this guy talks about mimesis all the time and how it's like a destructive tendency that builds up in primate species, and how the sacrifice ends up eliminating that cycle, like the scapegoat. But language is seen by Aragons in a similar light, where he proposes an originary condition where previously, like, indexical and iconic indications were present, so marks and even like certain sounds which connoted certain things were present, but there wasn't that gulf where you jump to symbolic representation until he places it in this like um this incomplete act of reference or ostensive reference. You have like ostensive gestures where you point to something, and then you have imperative indications where, like, hey, this thing must happen, or you have interrogative, or you have declarative. And for him, language emerges with this interrupted ostensive. So if you were the alpha and you like go to move towards the food, then that would tell everyone immediately, oh, this is what's going on. This is the social setting. This is where I'm going to fit in. And it'll breed tension. So Gans proposes that the initial sign was actually an appropriative gesture that was aborted. And the fact that it was aborted is what severs it from its underlying referent, and it becomes this freestanding sign. And then in a process of development, that leads to the possibility of the imperative, where now you have this abortive gesture, which indicates the activity but doesn't complete it. Then just indicating it in the abstract, like, calls for the completion of it in some form, and you feel anxiety if it doesn't get completed because of the underlying tension about, there's going to be mimetic conflict and dominance hierarchy, funny business, and someone's going to get hurt. And so, like, the interrogative, or rather imperative form itself carries a kind of anxiety with it, because you're afraid of that originary violence that language itself was meant to dispel or mediate somehow. And then you go to the interrogative and asking questions. It's sort of like an imperative, and you get mad. If someone asks, if you have ask a question of like someone working in the store and they just ignore you and they don't answer you get really upset sometimes. I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's so expected that it ought to be completed. And where does that come from? Maybe because of the originary condition with language, that it was a tool for mitigating conflict that was otherwise so destructive that, like, the whole tribe would have anxiety about it. So with these marks, it's like you could see that having a similar kind of mediating role to minimize the amount of bloodshed between two neighboring wolf tribes. They learn this language of marking with pheromones and urine, and they they end up respecting that, because if they don't, there's going to be a lot more violence. And so conflict mediation and avoidance is sort of the underlying threat that motivates compliance with marks, perhaps, and also with imperatives in interrogatives in verbal speech.
Yeah, I've never been much of a fan of the idea that language itself, or even gesture, was the basis for how language could first get traction in order to stay. The important thing about all this is that something has to stay. And if you imagine the earliest times of, our human or hominid or hominin development, then you kind of have to say, well, how did we come to this point where the meaning of a given sound being associated with a given thing had gotten enough traction, had sort of seeded itself deeply enough that it could persist across generations and yield conventional spoken language? Because again, the spoken language, with a few exceptions, Saussure notes some, like if a baby goes moo, right? Or you say moo for a cow, right? It sounds kind of like a cow, and you can say, okay, that's a cow, that's sort of motivated, right? But for the most part, the structuralism, the linguistic structuralism of Saussure, is absolutely built on the full recognition of the arbitrary nature of the language. What occurred to me early on because I was looking at how slaves were marked and branded, how cattle are marked and branded, how territorial stones in cultures that do not have written language but do have marks in addition to their spoken language, how marks were applied to things, how beekeepers' marks were put on their hives, or how foresters' marks were put on trees, or how all these various non-linguistic marks were put on tin or bronze ingots, or on hides branded on them, and all the rest. I thought to myself, well, wow, this sort of fundamental grammatical basis for language is the idea of a subject and predicate. Now, I don't know how it's taught in linguistics today, but I certainly remember that growing up in school, we had to figure out what the subject was of the sentence and what the predicate was. And then you get into things like object and the rest, right? But predicare in Latin means to publicly say or to state, right? So if you've got a subject, well, that's an object or a person or a thing, an animal perhaps, that has been made subject, subjugum, to be made subject, to be dominated by the placing of a mark, which indicates what you are. And placing the mark upon the object is the fundamental act of predication. And that mark is necessarily relatively lasting. So when I think back to human history and I think, well, how the hell did we get to the point where we could say this thing stays and it means this thing? It's another argument for writing broadly construed, not as linguistics construes it, but as we're doing here. If we construe writing in this sense, then it's a very straightforward thing to say either you have an acorn and we know that it comes from an oak tree. And so we can carry around the acorn and it becomes a lasting indicator of what is an oak tree. That's kind of the idea of a token, which is, again, has no requirement for spoken language to exist at that point, and arguably could give you a way for language to get traction and stay over time, because there's a token that carries the meaning that can be physically transferred across generations, right? Or you make the mark on the animal. There are a lot of these cave paintings at Lascaux that show weird marks that are superposed on the painting of the buffalo or the lion or whatever. They're marks made on the object, and I think of that as the fundamental act of making subject through the placing of a predicate, which is itself a mark. Now we know, for example, if you have a V branded on your thumb, that's V for vagabond, right? That means you've been caught by the authorities and marked. You've been clipped. Your ears have been cut, as we do with livestock. Or they tattooed on the forehead the stigma of DAM for damnato ad metallum, to be sent to the mines, as a punishment in Rome, right? Or when the Athenians captured, one group or another, they might tattoo a mark on their foreheads to show that they're prisoners and slaves in a way that is indelible. So tattooing, branding, cutting of ears, or even in the prehistoric period, you could have taken a stick and put pigment on it and then pressed it against the side of an animal to leave a relatively lasting mark that would enable you to identify it. And the Bakhtiari nomads, they don't just brand animals, they will also sometimes take their branding iron and put it in ink and just stick it against the side of the animal. So I think that there's a stronger case to be made for writing being the substratum that gave enough of a lasting signifier signified relationship or subject predicate relationship upon which the more complex aspects of spoken language could be layered.
Yeah, I like that. Let's go back to video and we'll have some discussion before we wrap up. But was there anything else in the slides you really wanted to get to?
Yeah, I'll do it very quickly.
Okay, sure.
We've got behavioral integration.
I did want to add, I found it interesting. So you use this term predicate. There are different etymologies, but the Latin predicare translated the Greek categorein, and categorein, the etymology there in the Greek, is a judgment pronounced in court. So saying like this defendant is either guilty or innocent. And then for Aristotle, like the categories, categorein, it's the same word, but it means the predicates, or you take a given subject and predicate these different terms onto it, either a designator of relation or quantity or quality or so forth. And so I just note a connection between the most fundamental predicative acts building up to sentences, propositions, logical arguments, demonstrations, scientific knowledge on that epistemological side, and then you're bringing in the same concept of the predicate category involved as well there, where you make this mark and you say like this becomes this type, and in a Platonic vein, I mean that is what predication does. You're taking universals which are formal and imposing them on matter which lacks form, and so by marking this space clearly, you're instantiating universals, which then move down, supervene, or in a not the metaphysical dependent sense, but in the sense that they're superordinate. They superordinate over the material situation, govern it. So the power here comes from multiple angles: genealogical, maybe anxiety of what marking and basic communicative acts were meant to avoid, but then also maybe metaphysically, like the marking process, you are imposing form on matter, and that just has a metaphysical potency. Like I think when you write a sign, it's not just the tendency of people to read it in a certain way. I feel like it has a kind of intrinsic mimetic force where the quality of the sign has an impact on its environment. Like, for example, I was in Rochester, New York at a park at one point, and I noted a drawing, a very like quality graffiti drawing of a fox. And like right next to it, there was a fox looking at its representation on the water tower. And it's not the only time like you see a crossing sign and then like you see a deer right there, right near the crossing sign. And I think that's what the ancient cave painters were trying to do as well in depicting these particular forms. They were summoning them. They were like evoking the symbolic power or the resonantal power of signs and then what they signify. So anyway, just what the political implication of all of this is: how do we use branding? How do we use marks? How do we design our own space and give formalism to it so that it transforms the environment and makes it more powerful for our purposes? But just wanted to note that. So
Yeah, and helps us integrate our behavior, right? The whole point of a culture and a people is that we will have organized and integrated behavior. We can make predications regarding our environment, which are non-arbitrary. And because they are non-arbitrary, unlike the textual castles in the air created by leftists and progressives and the rest, they have survival advantage. To your point about the stamping, I mean, and categorein and the rest, I mean, look at archetypos, the governing stamp, or the idea of memory, which you certainly see in Plato, the idea of, making an impression on wax. Well, I'm sorry, you see it certainly with Aristotle and the early art of memory, people like Cicero and others there, Quintilian. So just to get through this very quickly, you've got this behavioral integration where the flag is raised, you will defend it. The flag is raised into the air. It allows us to organize our behavior in battle. It allows us to organize our behavior socially, like, the last stand of the men around the bullet-riddled and torn standard, because that is the last point of organization. And when it falls, the stand is over. And so we see geese defending themselves against a fox here because they're close to their nest. So there are a lot of parallels there. I could go into them, but I want to move through this very quickly. Another one is when we were talking about behavioral integration through mark making with the scent marks and the relative heights of them. We can see how larger, same size, smaller, those are indicators of behavioral predispositions. If the one animal comes along and sees the mark of a larger one, like we were talking about earlier, you're going to have predispositions to behavior. They're going to be, likely to contest if they're the same size, to figure it out. If one is smaller, it will usually retreat. If one is larger, it will advance and drive the other one away. So we see behavioral integration in that respect with insignia in the military, where if you're higher rank, you command, if you're lower rank, you obey. And there is very much a sort of metaphorical vertical axis there. And the penalty in times of war for disobeying a direct order, it can be you being frog marched out and shot. So that's another aspect of this behavioral integration. And one last one I want to show here, I'll do it very quickly. The trace. We like to think that our signature, which indicates who we are, is a kind of writing, but it really isn't. If it were, then we wouldn't have a second blank underneath where we're supposed to sign, where we write our name in a legible way. It makes it a trace. The idea is that no one else could make our signature, so we can be sure that when this signature was made, because it might not even be legible, only my hand will make it this way because I write with a particular hand. And we're very often encouraged to make it somewhat illegible, so it makes it more difficult to counterfeit it, right? Here's a situation where everyone will say, oh, that's writing. And I'm like, no, that's marking, and it is indexical. It is a trace. And that's why, in order to verify your signature, they don't just need to read it and see that it says Oliver Perrin. What they do is they pull up in their records the authorized archetype, which is your signature card, and they compare the two signatures. It has nothing to do with its legibility. Likewise, with the tagging, which gets used to make marks, territorial marks, there's a whole tradition of making it as illegible as possible in order to make it more difficult to reproduce. There's also the aspect of there being a secret there. Only the person who is responsible for the mark can tell you what it, so to speak, says. And then the last one to throw in here is that very often you'll see writing that you think is that the important thing is about its legibility and the rest, but you can see that it is a territorial marker. In World War I, if I went across the lines, lost at night from Italian territory to German language speaking territory, let's say Austrian, right? And I came across a house and I walked inside, even if I can't read German, if I see that the typeface is Fraktur, you see that it is, you're within the territory that uses that type of writing, which is the German language speaking territories. So here again, we have something like we saw with the signature cards, where everyone's like, oh, that's writing. I'm like, well, not exactly, or not only. There is the dimension of it where it is a kind of territorial mark, indicating that you're in a given region, even if you can't read it, which again signals that it's a whole other interesting subject, which is the way in which writing proper even can function as a non-linguistic mark in these other respects that we see, for example, with Fraktur versus Antiqua as a typeface, or with tagging or personal signatures. So let me jump out of here. Hopefully, yeah, that disappeared.
Yep. To bring
and
myself
what
back.
am I looking at for your? You have some sort of PFP here. Is this some sort of tree of life?
Yeah, it is a depiction of Yggdrasil from a Swedish cloth, and it's where we got the RTTL logo from. That I'm trying to remember the name of that cloth now, but in any case, it has Christian imagery combined with some pagan imagery, and we accept both Christians and pagans. It's like a pan-European heritage association, so we thought it was appropriate. But that does obviously tie into what this whole presentation was about and what marks are meant to do, and the potency they really do have for shaping expectations, shaping, I guess, primarily the behavior of the linguistic community or the community of users of the mark. And it, raises a lot of interesting speculation about what we can do to formalize to a greater extent without making it artificial, because part of what makes the mark concept powerful is that it's rooted in a local causal environment. The dog actually has to pee on the tree, and the limitations of how that may take place give the semantic value to the reading of the mark. It's not an abstract thing. And yet when we, in a liberal political tradition, start thinking about how we can organize I guess, mark and establish boundaries in our political territory and how we cooperate, we tend to be very logocentric and abstract and universal, which is not going to have the same kind of potency. Uh, X hypothesi, according to the model that you're building out, where there is this deeper substrate of communicating meaning that everything else with human behavior is built on top of. And so if we leave that layer out, then we're not going to manage or cooperate as organizations as effectively. Even organizations themselves can be seen as a form of marking and indicating dispositions and tendencies towards behavior. So, like, I'm the president of RTTL, which, okay, there's a role. It's kind of just an abstract conceptual thing. But like you mentioned with these Renaissance, like mnemonic techniques, they would create kind of internal spaces. They would, like, the palace of the mind is one of these concepts, where you create this palace and then you fill each individual room with the concepts that you're trying to constellate and coordinate and, keep pinned down in your memory. So organizations are like that. You have the organizational map or diagram of what are all the roles. And so even though it's not quite spatial in a traditional sense, there is a tree structure that you end up recovering, and that's a stable geometry that then constellates everyone's actions across time. So there's a lot of parallels, and probably more than we're even beginning to touch on here. But what's interesting about it is that it's both descriptive and useful in understanding how we got to the kind of complex behavior we see, but then it's also prescriptive and tells us, how we can indicate these divisions in a way that's according to nature, like Plato's quote from, which one is this from? I would usually remember. Maybe it's from the Sophist. But cutting up nature at the joints, like a good butcher, and not cutting through bones. So, like, the natural marks, the natural kinds in a primitive condition are obvious. It's like, okay, where the dog can pee on the tree is just fixed by nature. With our situation, it's a lot more complex and derivative. But if we don't always bear in mind, like, the underlying causal context and what behavioral tendencies are really being symbolized or indicated, then, we're going to draw up castles in the air that aren't helpful devices for actually organizing and imposing form. So it gives a bunch of clues for, like, how do you put these things together? What insignias or what ranking designators will actually be effective? Have you incorporated, like, a line of traditional symbols in this concept as well, where there's an inertia in the semantic field of how a given culture marks its space? Like, we are in a liberal tradition, like I mentioned. Does that entail that we ought to draw further from the classical liberal thought experiments and arguments and labels for democratic processes and so forth, that, like, now that's part of our semantic territory and we better pick it up and use it? Or do you think we have more latitude? How do we, now that we have this scheme laid out, how do we start picking signs, insignias, logos, brands, organizational structures in a way that accords with nature? And how far are we constrained by our own traditions, and how much creative freedom do we have there?
Yeah, I don't know how much, I haven't looked specifically into the idea of whether or not, a given set of geometric forms that are known in a given region are going to resonate versus another group, because there's actually quite a bit of overlap in them. The things that we call, or that I mentioned earlier, called tamgas, that you see in the Caucasus, there are versions of them as far away as Mongolia and Poland and Latin America via Spain and North Africa. So there's actually a large group of forms that come out of the steppes that have been retained as cattle branding signs across the world. So there's quite a bit that's actually shared. I don't know I have not given thought, to answer your question, to which particular signs, in terms of their formal characteristics graphically, might be most resonant. My thinking at present is centered on the idea that the leftists, the progressives, what have you, have had considerable success by taking Saussurian structuralism and via figures like those in the Frankfurt School, or like Gramsci, again, who was first and foremost a trained linguist, and it shows in all his programs. They have decided upon, because again, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and these other things that we talked about at the beginning, they have settled upon speech and written language as being the ideal vehicle for them to subvert or remake human societies and cultures in the way that they wish. But they almost don't see this world that I'm talking about here. They don't want to recognize it. It's not their clean ivory tower.
It's why they hate the swastika so much.
That's where I was going to go, because it's not just the swastika. Remember that when the swastika was big, they were also reintroducing what were called by the Germans Hausmarken, which is their way of saying hallmarks, but literally hallmarks, like not in this case specifically just marks to indicate the value or purity of silver or gold, right? These are the old idea of the mark upon the hall that indicates the household, or the grouping otherwise. So you didn't just have the swastika, you had a major program of reorganizing society, or realigning society over or through, I should say, through non-linguistic marks that were deployed in the old traditional way. So under this banner, this is your mark. This is the mark that you see militarily. It's also, what you might see carved over the doorway of a house. I'm not so sure yet how best to take advantage of an understanding that this is the communicative substrate. But certainly there should be ways to exploit it as a territory. It's like, the old Shakespeare line about I'm going to delve beneath their minds and blow them to the moon, right? They're trying to tunnel under your walls and they think they've gone deep. But if their primary technique is to use speech and written language, and arguably you could say that here is an older, deeper basis for human social organization, then here's an opportunity to dig deeper on a level that they do not operate in as much. The thing is that there are ways, we don't have time to get into them now, where the government shows that it very clearly is very concerned with marks. If you get involved with trademark infringement, you're going to be in trouble and the law will come down on you. If you get involved with outdoor advertising, which is just another way to say putting marks at important routes and intersections, right? You're going to get into trouble, because it's not like, the government very directly controls, municipal or otherwise, or federal government with, billboards along highways. They're very serious about like marking routes and marking space. Another area where they get really serious is the non-linguistic marks associated with currency. Counterfeiting. They will crawl right up your ass and put you in jail forever. So despite the fact that the academic left doesn't understand the importance of this sort of deeper level of territorial marks, it's understood at law, even if the lawyers that are applying the law don't see the whole picture that we're talking about here. The whole picture that we're talking about here was understood before widespread literacy and some of these other innovations that we've suffered over the last couple hundred years. And so the legal control over many of these things as a specific category of behavioral integration, that those legal aspects are there and have to be grappled with. But I think if clever people on the right will look at the kind of work I'm doing, look at the things that maybe I am not seeing yet, that this entire picture is rife with opportunities. It's full of opportunities, full of potential for being exploited effectively and carrying our program forward in a way that is less arbitrary than what we see with spoken language. The thing is, leftists know in their guts, communists, the rest of them, and otherwise, they know in their guts that there are real issues with this. They will become upset if you just put up any kind of non-linguistic insignia. Look at like Generation Identity in Europe. You know, they have their own insignia, you know, or like the lambda or whatever of the Spartans. As soon as leftists start to see those signs being used by anyone other than their own groups, they'll come down on it like like a hammer.
Well, because at some level, everyone does detect the underlying significance here, and
They
it's
can
something that
feel
you
it. Yeah.
use it unconsciously. So, is it possible to bridge a gap where you go from unconscious being directed by these symbols and signs and marks to consciously understanding the theory about how they're put together, how they have imperative force, how they actually do structure environments? The group that can figure that out is going to go a long way. And clearly, like, corporations understand this. They put a lot of thought into branding and non-linguistic elements in how they sell their products. So it's interesting. We have to move to a fraternal benefit society model with Return to the Land rather than a pure private membership association. And one of the legal requirements of having a FBS is that you have to have rituals and regalia, and they have to be bona fide. They can't just be like for show and you only do it once every 2 years or something. So in order to have our own space and defend freedom of association for our people in our group, we're literally legally required actually to establish certain rituals and non-verbal like symbolic practices, which just interesting. So I'll be bearing a lot of what you've said in mind as we're looking at that ritual regalia symbol question for our TTL. But I've had this tendency for a long time to think of, in Boy Scouts, you get a badge, or, I got a trophy for winning this tournament or musical competition. It's like, it's just a token. It doesn't mean anything, but it does mean a lot more than we think. And the set of names and charts and, a guideline documents and writing up formal prospectuses rather than just talking informally, like imposing that form and that structure really makes the difference between the organizations that take off and make it and those that don't. We think of it in terms of like the leftists do, this pure domain of language and pure universals. So when we get together and we discuss plans, we remain informal. Informal itself means the lack of form. We're not marking those spaces. It's in some scrolling text chat on Discord or Telegram or wherever. And it just remains at this kind of level of matter, and matter's not active. Causal potency comes from the top down, and establishing these boundaries, marking these boundaries, I do think of in terms of like summoning a nomological order. You're summoning ordering principles that actually come into the world and do things effectively, but not from the bottom up. So solving this question of how to build effective organizations, it is an intersection of the mystical with the linguistic and semiotic, and then
And
also ethological
Yeah.
too. Yeah, there's many layers. And so I guess the correct proportionality between the levels of either mark or sign or symbol or whatever level of the abstraction chain it's on, all of it has to be consistent and resonant with our own background, that genealogical dimension that maybe gives it some psychological potency because our ancestors have been observing these things for so long. So you got to tap into those, just like with in sales. You don't just talk about the product. You also, when you're engaging with someone, you're sensitive to pathos and what are the sentiments, and is my like body positioning compatible with theirs. And if you're not thinking about the subliminal deep psychological stuff, you're going to be a bad salesman. If you're only thinking explicitly about here are the merits of my product, it's just not going to work. So but that we do need a proper proportioning of the more like atavistic primitive elements, like peeing on a certain area or whatever, and seriously think about it as well, and then grade that with the increasing abstraction and universality of higher order signs and symbols. And it's not like we have to privilege or prioritize the baser level or like the more primordial level of that chain. But if we don't locate it
But we
and
can't
don't,
ignore it.
yeah, you can't. No, it does have to be a certain kind of foundation. And if it's unmoored, then probably the whole chain loses a lot of potency. So it makes it awkward then that foundation seems to be rooted in smell, because I don't know what to do with that exactly.
Well,
That component,
it's not, it's rooted in space.
right?
It's not rooted in scent. Remember, the olfactable signal is at a point or a sequence of points or marking a path. So like for rituals for you, I just throw it out there, and I am available as a consultant.
Okay.
But in terms of laying out the basics, I would look at patrolling, the physical act of moving around your borders in a regular way. I don't mean patrolling it in the sense of, oh, they've got a compound over there and check out these guys. They're marching through with AR-15s. This is really worrying. Yeah. No. What I'm talking about.
So we can't have our ritual small unit tactics, because we're going to start that.
No, it would
any day now.
That's a separate ritual, which is also welcome and necessary. But this one, I'd say, like members of the community, they take lanterns and they walk at night around the territorial perimeter. There's a lot that we didn't get into with place boundary and border cells and the hippocampus and orientation and memory. And the way in which memory is tied to space and movement in space. But you can actually sort of cut a path through parts of your mind by walking the same route. And you could just do it as a community gathering in the evening, where certain people just take lanterns and they walk through the darkness and look at their land in the light of their lantern as a sort of pilgrimage of their own. There's also just the basic aspect of being informed by this in such a way that you are able to see what's actually there. So like they talk about the broken windows theory, right? And Giuliani really straightened up New York with the broken windows, theory. They just didn't allow broken windows to. No, it's not the broken windows theory. It's the don't put up with competing territorial claims in the form of graffiti theory. By removing the contesting territorial claims immediately and not permitting them, you are showing fundamentally that you are patrolling your space and you are the dominant force there. So, it's not necessarily that you have to pull a particular course of action out of the implications of all of this. It's more, I think, that you should see for the first time what you're looking at in terms of what's actually going on. The competing territorial claims take a manifest form based on this background of animal behavior. And if you properly understand it, you can even see ways like when I showed the Fracture versus the Antiqua typeface. I don't need to be able to read, whatever script is currently being Devanagari or whatever that's currently being used by Indians in order to understand that those are marks of territorial dominance in a region. If I go down a street, I don't need to read the signs in whatever Prakrit we're thinking of, or the current languages of the Indian subcontinent. I don't have to be able to read them as writing proper in order to understand them, or Chinatown or whatever, or all the kebab joints with Turkish. In order to understand them as competing territorial marks and their proliferation as an indication that this space is no longer controlled.
Right. No, really good stuff. I hope we can have another stream at some point and get into some of those areas we did not touch on. And I'm about to start the Return to the Land podcast in about a half hour, so we will have to wrap up. No time for questions from the chat, but thanks everyone for tuning in. Before we go, anywhere people can find your writing. Do you still make videos? You've been active?
Yes, I've been inactive for quite some time, and I put that down to marriage and fatherhood. But I will be starting again and soon. In terms of finding me, you can find me on X, at Semiagog. You can find me on YouTube. My channel there is Semiagog. And you can find me elsewhere. I probably got vestigial identity over on Telegram, but X and YouTube, primarily X, are the main places. If you're interested in my writing that relates to these things, there's traditional marking systems, which you can find on Amazon. I was a co-author and editor for this book. It's a fat volume full of studies of non-linguistic marking systems around the world, with input from all sorts, primarily archaeologists, of all sorts of scholars from around the world. I've got a piece, I think I sent it over to you, but it's over here in Language Sciences. This is volume 33, issue 4, and it has my piece in there on integrational semiology and my ideas about marking. There's also remarks. We did one of these issues, but it's the Journal of Signum, International Society for Mark Studies. It's a academic organization that we started some time back, and there is a paper in here of mine on uncertainty in mark predication as related to commerce. And then lastly, and quickly, if anyone is interested, I have a collection of my poems called Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth. That is available on Amazon. And I have a book of mine. It's called Vinculum, and it is sort of a cyberpunk-ish science fiction story set in Istanbul in the year 2076. A book thief is pursued by remorseless corporate hitmen and an esoteric sect of assassins. So please do buy my books so that I can continue to buy diapers. Otherwise, thank you all for putting up with my long-winded droning. Thank you very much, Arvel, for having me on as a guest. I'm glad we got to talk.
Thank you for coming on. No, very enlightening, interesting perspective, one you don't hear a lot about. Most people are not so interested in linguistics or semiotics, but I think for the attentive listener, we've shown why it may actually be very relevant for us and worth consideration. So thank you, Oliver Perrin. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.